Welcome back, fellow adventurers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we journey into narrative design with Lucas Loredo, a master of crafting immersive game narratives. With his extensive background in narrative design at WolfEye Studios, Lucas brings a unique perspective to our topic today. We're diving into the intricacies of creating narratives where players are free to disrupt the traditional storytelling elements and still maintain a cohesive experience. Lucas, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here, Gerald. Thanks for having me.
So, full disclosure, I bumped into you first at Susan O'Connor's The Narrative Department's Masterclass. You were the pro reader for Masterclass 1 that I did last fall. And your feedback, your insights were inspirational, a little cutting. There was a little bit of learning I had to do there, but...
hopefully they were delivered softly enough that you could absorb them.
Once you stopped yelling and swearing, it was all easy. Easy peasy.
Nice. I'm glad they were helpful.
They were. Honestly, they were. I went back and rewrote what I had worked on, and fantastic. So,
yay.
You've been on my list before that, though, because of Weird West. Mm-hmm. What a game. What a cool game.
Thank you.
Finally getting you in the studio, I'm pumped. Let's dig into this.
Happy to be here.
We're here to talk about stories in games, narratives in games, where the player is free to disrupt the traditional structure, including things like killing off the main character, and still maintain cohesive, fun experience, or a cohesive, rewarding experience. So, before we dig into that, though, I'm just setting the stage. But before we dig into that, I do like to get your origin story first. How did you fall in love with gaming and writing? How did you get into it as far as education or stumbling your way into the industry? And then what's your journey to where you are today? And take as much time as you need.
Thank you. Well, I love this question. I love hearing where writers came from. I love the origin story of all of my favorite writers. Where does mine begin? I would say that mine begins probably where a lot of writers' stories begin, which is a really awesome English teacher. So for me, it was in high school. I had a teacher named Michael Blankenberg. Loved Mr. Blankenberg. He was great. But before then, believe it or not, I hated writing and I hated reading. I don't know how. I'm now a professional writer, but when I was young, I just wasn't into it. I would get assigned essays to write in school. It was like, pulling teeth. I would get assigned books and I would also pull my teeth out. I pulled my hair out. You can see there's very little left. And so I didn't think that English was really for me. But when I was a junior in high school, I had a teacher named Michael Blankenberg, and in that class, we read a couple books that changed my relationship to reading, and we had a couple assignments that changed my relationship to writing. Those books we read The Catcher in the Rye, as you do in high school, and then we read this other book named The Things They Carried. I don't know if you or any of your listeners have read The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. It's one of my favorite books, which is a bit odd because it's a series of short stories / memoir about Tim O'Brien, who was in Vietnam. War stories are really not my thing. I have no inherent interest in them, but the writing was just so beautiful and honest that it struck a chord in me. And so the assignment was, we read Catcher in the Rye. And then for anyone who read that book, Holden Caulfield's voice. You can sort of hear it in your head, the sort of snarky but damaged teen who's just trying to find his way in the world and making lots of mistakes and whatever. And he has a lot of linguistic tics that are, if you're trying to imitate him, pretty easy to pick up on and sort of reproduce. Mm-hmm. And so the assignment was, in the voice of Holden Caulfield, write an essay about the things they carried. And so I had this assignment to sit down, write about the things they carried using this voice, and I had never thought about how writing could be fun, creative, that I could inhabit the voice of a character. And I found it to be completely freeing. And in that class, we had a couple more assignments. I wrote a short story, which I had never experienced before, and just totally fell in love with that. And then sort of slowly what happened was I started writing to, maybe as many writers have done in their career, to try to heal a personal wound. So my mom had passed away when I was in middle school, and my relationship with my dad was such that we weren't really talking about it a lot, but I found that when I wrote about it, my dad would read what I wrote and really take it in. And so what happened was I started writing these short stories about a boy who and his father, after the mother has passed away, the dynamics between them, what the boy finds challenging in the father, what the boy hoped from his father, all these sorts of things. And then I was just giving those stories to my dad. And it was a way for us to, at least I felt, communicate about what was happening, even though it felt like it was a topic that was impossible to approach in real life.
Mm.
So that's sort of like how I started writing. And so I started moving towards like the realm of fiction. I went to my undergraduate at Stanford and got my degree in creative writing there. I was writing short stories and doing workshops and all that sort of stuff. I moved to New York to become a writer, and I was writing short stories and, moonlighting as an SAT and ACT tutor while I was writing short stories, and then eventually got into the Michener Center here in Austin, where I live, which is a master's program where you have 3 years to work on your craft and you get a living stipend. You don't have to teach. Your whole job for 3 years is just to write. And so that's what I did. And I was really I was fully on board with the I am going to write novels track. And then life intervened, and my childhood love for video games ended up leading me to take a class on game writing while I was in graduate school with Susan O'Connor, who you know and love, and who I love and have become very close to over the years. She taught a class on game writing, and it sparked an interest in me where I thought, oh, wow, I never thought about writing for games, but that could be pretty cool. And after I graduated, Susan helped me find my first job in the industry. And when the novel writing wasn't really panning out in the way that I wanted to, I found a job in games and have just been going full bore gung-ho ever since, trying to absorb every single nugget of information I can and technique I can to adjust to this medium, which is, to me, I personally feel one of them. I mean, every medium has its challenges, but I would say that game writing requires the most elasticity and sort of like Swiss Army knife of writer than any other form of writing. So, my background in fiction writing, but also in studying poetry. I wrote some immersive theater pieces back when I was in New York. I wrote some radio, wrote some screenplays. Like, I did a lot of different kinds of writing. And it feels like it's all come together really nicely in game writing, which requires you to sort of at least have somewhat of an understanding of all those different forms of writing.
Which one would you say is the closest to game writing?
Oh, man. Without a doubt, hands down, immersive theater.
Yeah.
So, I think it's kind of a misconception that many have, that I also had before I went into game writing, that what's the closest thing to writing? Well, certainly it's a screenplay, right? Mm-hmm. Because, it's a visual medium, or TV writing, right? It's a visual medium. Oh. You see what's happening. There are cutscenes that read very much like film. But the key difference is that in a film, the audience members in the theater have no say as to what happens on screen. Right. Whereas with immersive theater, if you're doing Sleep No More, I don't know if you've heard of Sleep No More.
I'm familiar, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So for anyone who doesn't, it was an immersive theater piece in New York that was basically a rendition of Hamlet, where all of the actors are sort of moving through the audience in a big warehouse with multiple rooms, and audience members are seeing some scenes and not seeing other scenes, and sometimes one of the actors will take you alone into a room by yourself and deliver a monologue to you. But what happens if the audience misbehaves or the audience does something different? Well, the narrative of that piece of writing, of theater, has to account for the spontaneity of the audience members, which is what we have to do in games all the time.
I really wanted to go see Sleep No More, but unfortunately,
man, me Did you not see? You haven't seen it either?
No.
Oh, I know. I've heard great things. Yeah.
Hopefully somebody comes out with something else that's similar vein, but yeah, not seeing that.
Well, there's also like all the Meow Wolf stuff. I don't know if you've seen any of the Meow Wolf.
No.
If you've never heard that phrase, you're probably like, Meow Wolf? What's that? But also, immersive theater experience, which I am forgetting where it is. Is it in New Mexico or Vegas? Or I'm sure people who know Meow Wolf are screaming through their headphones right now. But they also do immersive theater experiences, and a lot of it is like set design, where you walk into a space and there's a story that's happening in the space that you're sort of piecing together through bits of recorded audio, through objects in the space. And I mean, the similarity to games is huge. If you think about an escape room is about as close as you can come to a video game, I think, without a console or a computer being involved, because it's like the experience has been designed for you. There's story that's happening as you move through the space, as you're interacting with the space. You have a set of verbs that you've been given. These are the ways you can interact with the right? When you go into an escape room, they say, these are the things you can do. Here are your verbs. Here are the things you can't do. The game is not going to respond if you do these things. There's audio recordings. You're solving puzzles, all this sort of stuff. I mean, that's a game in a nutshell.
Really good escape rooms deliver a masterclass in environmental storytelling.
Yes,
like there's every little piece has something to do with the narrative, or
absolutely.
Love it.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're gonna dig in here. Before we do, I am curious. I warned you we were gonna wander off.
I love to wander. Take me on a journey, Gerald.
You met novels. The show is about storycraft and fiction and games and all that, but I also like to talk to novelists, and I have 4 manuscripts in a cabinet over there that'll never see the light. So, is novel writing something you want to return to someday? Is that itch still there?
Oh man, Gerald, my relationship to novel writing, I saw my therapist the last 2 weeks in a row about it. Yeah. Same. So you have the 4 novels in a drawer. You know what it's like.
Yeah.
I think that my relationship to novel writing these days has improved quite a bit. I think that for anyone who has fashioned themselves a writer over the course of many years, you've devoted yourself to it, written short stories, written drafts of novels, gotten to a place where that's what people know about you. Oh, Lucas. Oh, Gerald. Right. The writer. You're working on novels, right? You see them. They ask you, how's the novel going? What are you working on? All these things, especially if you go to school for it. If you do 3 years of devoted writing, I worked on the same novel for 3 years. I wrote probably 1,000 pages of material for that novel and threw out 600, 700 of those pages. Wow. And then, for folks who have other friends who are writers, then you might see them publishing their novels and your novel is still in a drawer. And that can be, while you're excited for them, it can be painful personally as well too, right? We're all human. As much as we're excited for our friends to succeed, it can also point out the fact that you're not succeeding in the way that you imagined. And so for me, I was going to say lucky, although I hesitate to use that word. I would say that I was forced to confront my relationship to novel writing a few years ago when I went through some mental health issues where I literally could not write anymore. So I was struggling with panic attacks, anxiety. It was a year before the pandemic. The pandemic made it only worse. And I developed, oh man, we're going to get deep, Gerald. I developed post-traumatic stress disorder from all the panic attacks I was having, living in fear of having panic attacks all the time. It was this cycle that meant that when I sat down to write, I couldn't concentrate for more than 30 seconds. I mean, seriously, I'm not even exaggerating. I would sit down to try to read a book and I couldn't even read a full paragraph, let alone a page, because the internal machinations of anxiety and panic were so strong that I just couldn't do it. That's when I started reading graphic novels, by the way. Anyone out there struggling with anxiety and you can't concentrate on novels, let me recommend You read some graphic novels to get you through. They're great.
Yep.
Pictures, baby. It makes the job easier. But so what happened was because I just couldn't write during that period of time. And it was a couple years where I really couldn't get back to the page. I was forced to uncouple my identity with writing. So before then, I was totally enmeshed with writing as an identity and personality. It's who I was, and specifically novel writing. And so in that moment, that span of time where I can't write novels anymore, then suddenly you wake up and you're like, what am I even doing? What is the purpose of my days? I used to write 1,000. Gerald, I used to write 1,000 words a day, 5 days a week. And I did that for like 5 years straight. That was my life.
Mm-hmm.
That was my life. And so when that goes away, there's all this empty space I didn't know what to do with. I didn't know what to spend my time doing. I was a person who loved the daily grind of working towards something big, and putting 1,000 words into a bucket every day was that, and was really satisfying. And so coming to game writing was also part of the process of just uncoupling myself from what became a fraught relationship with novel writing. And game writing really came at a great time for me, because I found I could write for games. I could collaborate with others, even if my own personal creative work in the novel space wasn't going well. So it was kind of a godsend in a way. And I will say that these days, Gerald, I am really doing well with the novels are still in the drawers, but like I found that life isn't all about that, and that there are other avenues to enjoy life, and you best be nimble about it and flexible about it, because sometimes life just is not going to give you what you want.
Yep, 100%. I'm happy to hear that, buddy. That's good. It's good that you're finding a healthy, happy place there.
Thank you. How are you doing with the novels in the drawers, Gerald?
I had a similar crisis many years ago, though, and again, it's identity. There's definitely a very strong psychological effect when you internalize an identity and you latch onto that. It becomes a core part of who you are. It becomes a pillar. If you want it inside out, it becomes a core memory. Like,
absolutely, yes.
So you have to recognize when that becomes unhealthy, when it becomes an obsession as opposed to a passion.
Yeah,
and then you work through it, and it's different for everybody. Some people have to break and then put themselves back together. Other people can adjust and pivot, and I may have been the broke person, but I'm back together. We're good now.
I can relate. I know. It makes me think of I can't remember the word for it right now, but there's, I believe, a Japanese art form of, you have pottery, and it breaks, and then instead of just gluing it back together or throwing it in the trash, you mend the pieces, and between all of the breakages, there's, I guess, the glue or something. I'm mangling this, but there's gold.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I know what you're talking about, yeah.
Right? So you'll see this mended piece of pottery that has all of these cracks in it that are, shining, like gold just sort of shining from the seams.
Yeah.
And, Gerald, that's what you are. That's what I am. We break, we put it back together, and then there's gold between the seams.
That's beautiful, dude. You should be a writer.
I've thought about it.
All right. Let's move on to less heady stuff for a while.
Yeah, great. Let's go. I'm ready.
Okay, so to the topic of the day, writing narratives in games that allow for players to mess with traditional narrative structures. Before we dig into it, what are some of those traditional narrative mechanisms that games rely on to function properly?
Yeah, so what narrative mechanisms to function properly? So I'm kind of thinking about the question first a little bit more broadly, as in what mechanisms make up a game. And I think in general, if I was going to boil it down to the very, very basics, there are conflicts, and then there are verbs we give the player to resolve those conflicts. So in a racing game, the conflict is I want to be first, and other cars are trying to also become first. And the verbs that we have are accelerate, decelerate, turn, all these things to sort of resolve that conflict.
Right.
In a puzzle game, similar. It's like the conflict is the puzzle is unsolved. And so the verbs that we give the player are, well, turn the Tetris blocks, and then you can solve that conflict. I think with games that are, I think probably what you're asking about are more like narrative-driven games, RPGs, that sort of thing. So I think in that context, the conflicts are this character wants something and they're going to try to get it. Do I, as a player, want them to succeed, or do I want them to not succeed?
Mm-hmm.
Or the conflict is maybe more like there's a mystery in the story and I want to find out the answer. And then the verbs we give the player are whatever the genre of game demands. So if it's a driving game, it's accelerate, decelerate, whatever. But if it's an RPG, it's probably walking around, doing spells. Maybe you have if it's a game that involves shooting, which is very common in the games world, although I kind of wish it was less common. But, then you have shoot, right? So it's conflicts, it's verbs. In terms of story mechanisms, again, like I think in an RPG or an action-y game, a game that's sort of like story heavy and is about people. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to like make these distinctions, but I forget sometimes good. There are puzzle games that have no human beings in them. So I just want to be clear that we're talking about games that have people and there are stories happening between people. I think what the narrative mechanisms there are commonly talk to a character. That's like one of the most common ones. It could be enter a space. So like I walk into a house, I walk into a town, that can trigger stuff. It could be a cutscene is triggered. That's like a narrative mechanism is a cutscene. So dialogues, cutscenes, finding objects often are narrative mechanisms. There's like story that happens around those things. So I think that's kind of an answer to the first part of your question. I think the narrative mechanisms you mean are probably things like dialogue, interacting with other characters, finding objects, entering and exiting spaces, that sort of thing.
You're right on point. That's definitely what we're trying to delineate here. But those are coming at it very much from a narrative design lexicon. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Somebody coming from comic book writing, film, novels, short stories, and they look at the idea of narrative mechanisms. Are they going to think things like 3-act structure and foils and plants and turns and climax and like your traditional narrative tools?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I would say yes, but all of them seem to have a twist. I think that the act structures feel, to me, games follow. I think the closest analog is probably television, structures of television episodes, because if you think about a game, how is the story content, how do we structure the arc of the story content? A lot of that has to do with how long is the person interacting with the medium. So like a movie generally is accepted that it's 2 to 3 hours long. Why? Well, because that's generally how long people are willing to sit in a theater. Cool. And so let's then structure that story around a 2 to 3 hour experience, right? And so we're going to tell a complete story that lasts 2 to 3 hours. So then a 3-act structure makes a ton of sense.
Right.
In television, I haven't written for television, but we've all watched plenty of it. It's based around the shape and size of an episode, whether it's a 20 or 30-minute episode or an hour-long episode. And the important thing is that it's going to keep going after the first episode. So you need to, at the end of each episode, hook the viewer so that they're excited and aching to return to the episode 2. The same thing with novels. Novels are also long form, but then oftentimes they'll have chapters, and you want to have a cliffhanger at the end of the chapter to hook the reader into the next one.
Right.
So when it comes to games, I feel like what we're talking about is a play session. And that's, I think, probably determined a bit by genre of game. Like, I could sit down and play Skyrim for like when I was younger. Not anymore. When I was younger with nothing to do, I could play for 10 hours, right? Incredible. If I'm sitting down and for me personally going and playing a puzzle game, maybe it's more like an hour. So, but I think the narrative structures that, at least in my work in RPGs mostly, are centered around the quest. It's like the quest is a great narrative building block because in general, people don't really want to stop their play session in the middle of a juicy side quest. And so, the idea would be for a side quest, you're doing almost like a mini movie, maybe. Maybe within the side quest, there is a satisfying arc with a beginning, middle, and end. It seems basic, but that is how these things work. Maybe there's a twist around Act 2, if you want to consider it that way. Mm-hmm. So I kind of think of narrative structure in that way. And then there are all the tools you described, like plant and payoff, totally still apply in games. But there are things that you don't consider in other mediums because they're not possible. Things such as if the player makes a choice at a certain moment, how can we then have the game be reactive to that choice, either in the short term or in the long term? Mm-hmm. And so there's like kind of an element of plant and payoff there, but it has to do with the player almost planting something and then us as the designers paying that off over time.
Nice.
Yeah.
That always brings to mind Shadows of Mordor, the game that had that system, Absolutely. The Nemesis system. That was brilliant.
We love the Nemesis system.
Wandering down a sidetrack for a second once again, I'm curious, you mentioned how film and TV and radio and novels, they have a structure that has established over the years through trial and error and become solidified. Do you think video games are going to eventually have a kind of a traditional structure, like you say, around quests, maybe inside of, and especially with live service, with seasons, and you start having to build narratives around seasons? Is there going to be a standard that comes out of this?
That's a great question. I will not pretend to know the answer. I think that where video games are as a medium, at least in my view or how I see it, it's still a relatively young medium. It's sort of like, if television is sort of like in its like 40s, where it's like established in its career and really knows how to do its career and is bopping along and like making all the money, like really knows what to do. And maybe movies are like, I don't know, in their 60s, they really know what's up. But maybe, the younger guns in television are coming for them. I think like games are probably in their like late teens or early 20s, And so I think we have figured out a ton about this medium. I'm still learning all the time, but I think because I think about sometimes if I was to sit down and write a book about narrative design, what would that look like? And would there be any rules, advice, structures that seem to apply across the board? And then the thing that's hard is that we have so many different genres. And again, like what I would say about what works in an RPG might not work in a linear action game, might not work in a puzzle game and a racing game. So I don't know how universal the structures will be. However, I do feel like there are standards that have evolved, tropes that, I mean, the medium is old enough now to have tropes, and like things that we know work. For instance, like a section of gameplay with a strong gameplay challenge that sort of like ratchets up in intensity. And then there is a crescendo point where you defeat the boss and then you get a cutscene. Mm-hmm. How many games are structured like that? So many. And they really are satisfying to play, right?
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Really satisfying to play. Challenge, crescendo of challenge. And then you get to take a break and watch a little movie. How great is that? And you get a rewardative story after you've earned it by completing this gameplay challenge. So I think that really works. I think that the structures around quests, I think people are learning how to do those effectively. If you look at like Obsidian, the Fallout games, or, Skyrims of the world, or, these sorts of games, you can sort of see, yeah, we're all sort of talking the same language when it comes to quest structure, but there's variation in everything. You know, our studio comes from the school of immersive sims, which means like the player's expression above all, sort of. And that's sort of what we value most, is the player getting to express themselves in as many ways as possible. That means we design quests a little different. We design missions a little different. But I do think that in the end, we're still talking about character. We're still talking about conflict. We're still talking about resolving conflict. We're still talking about characters wanting things and needing things. The difference in games is that you have this really unusual, hard to predict quantity, which is the player. And the question that, you know, Susan, one of the first questions Susan's brought up, or in the class I took, probably what she told you in the narrative department, is like the question of, is the player the protagonist? Really?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Seems obvious that he or she is, but the thing is, you can't control what the player does. You can guide and put guide rails on what the player does, but if the player doesn't want to participate in the story you're trying to tell them, then you have an uncooperative main character. So is it actually smart to put all your marbles in that basket story-wise, or is it smarter to put your marbles in the basket of these two NPCs over there having a really compelling story, and you can get in there as a player and influence it maybe, but in the end, those two characters, and Susan says this all the time, those two characters 100% believe in the story that they are in, because they are NPCs and we tell them what to do, right?
Yep.
And that's sort of where I think a lot of the emotional depth can come from. And so that's a long answer that is not probably exactly answering your question, but I think that's indicative of where we're at.
I was looking for your opinion and you nailed it. So perfect. And it's brilliant. I agree. So let's pull this together. Back on point, taking all that into consideration, how can you disrupt? What were creative ways to disrupt some of those without losing the story's coherence? How can you let players fiddle with the mechanisms without breaking things?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, it's what we think about at WolfEye all the time. It's what we're thinking about all the time on Weird West. It's what we're thinking about when we're making the new game that we're making, Secrets. But I think that this question really comes down to what verbs you give the player, and then in terms of the way that you're designing your game, can those verbs influence the way that the story mechanisms are happening? That's super abstract. So like a concrete example would be, let's say you're playing a typical RPG. Let's say you're playing Skyrim. Most people know Skyrim. You're going around, you're completing quests. There's lots of stories happening and such. What verbs does the player have? Well, they can run, they can jump, but also they can attack, right? So attacking is one of the main things that you do through various means. So we have those verbs. What mechanisms are we using to deliver the story? We're using environmental storytelling. That's a really strong one. You walk into a space and the space itself is telling a story through the props, through stuff you see on the wall, through the decoration, the interior design, all that. Also, dialogue is probably delivering the story too. Okay. And let's just take those two to start. So now you got to look at your verbs: running, jumping, moving around, attacking. Can those things mess with the ways we're delivering the story? So over here you have environmental storytelling. Can I mess with the environment? Can I like destroy my sense of the story in the environment by running around in it? No, that's not really going to affect the environment. If I jump around on stuff, not really. Can I attack the buildings and destroy them? No. So like those verbs aren't a problem with that mechanism, right? But think about dialogue with an NPC. Can I use the verb run to mess up a dialogue? No, not really. When you talk to them, you're frozen in place. You can't do anything. Can I jump around and mess with the dialogue? No. Can I attack this mechanism? Can I attack the NPC and ruin the dialogue? Yes, I can. So these are the moments, that's like a big giant red flag, which means you're going to have to design for this. So I guess the way that I see the question is like, when you're looking at your game, how are you delivering the story? And do you give the player verbs that can mess with that? Because if you think about Skyrim again, what if it was a game just about, what if you couldn't attack in that game and everything was about diplomacy and talking and whatever? In that case, you can't do anything to change the bedrock of the story because you can't, kill people who are supposed to deliver dialogue.
Right.
In our games that we have worked on so far at WolfEye, we deliver story through dialogue, and that's the hairy one. Not all through dialogue, but that's the hairy one because we also can shoot people in our games. And in our games, since we're, really from the school of immersive sims, which means like if we give you a gun and say you can shoot, by golly, you're going to be able to shoot whatever you think you should be able to shoot. And if you can attack, an NPC in a quest who's a bad guy, then in order to not break immersion, we're not going to say, oh, well, he's a good guy, you can't attack him, because it doesn't make any sense with the rules of the game as we've set them up. Think about other story mechanisms like finding an item. Say you're looking for a special treasure that has a map, and that's what you're trying to do. Having a gun isn't a problem in that case. I can't attack the item in my inventory, right? So like a journal or a note, for instance, is a really safe place to put story because you can't attack it, right? You can't destroy it because of the way that we've set up our verbs. Maybe we decided you actually can shoot journals and tear them up and explode them. Now you have a new set of problems that you have to design around. So the original question was like, how can you disrupt things and then
without losing the story?
Without losing the story. Yeah. So the way that you do that is you try to be smart about if you're allowing first of all, you're in control as the designer. So like the notion that the player could do something using their verbs that would destroy the story in a surprising way is not really how it works from the developer side, because the idea is that we have play tested this so much. We've had so many eyes on this that in theory, we've seen every way the player thought they could mess with the story. And by that point, we have fixed it, right?
Yeah.
So as the player, you think when you go and say in Weird West, there's a character named Sheriff Albright at the very beginning of the game. Weird West spoilers. Beware. Gerald, have you played? If you have, anyway, I'm about to spoil something.
I'm good.
Okay, so Sheriff Albright, it turns out later in the story that she is secretly a monster. She's a siren. She's posing as a sheriff, but she's actually this monster that in our game we call sirens. So if you're the player and you say, oh, I'm going to really test this game. They gave me a gun. Here's the main character. This is seemingly a main character in this story, which she is. She reappears throughout the story. I'm going to test things and see if I can kill her. What will happen if I do that? And what happens if you shoot her is that she takes it for a second, and then after a certain threshold, she turns into a siren and starts attacking you. So in that case, what we've done is we have planned for the possibility that the player would attack this character. And we actually already have story material that we were going to reveal later on. Sheriff Albright is a siren that we're now revealing in this moment because you sort of forced our hand. Right. As the player, you get to feel really cool because you had an experience that feels like you've gone off the rails of the narrative. But the truth is we've really designed for that. And so kind of the way that I think about this from the design side is the question of like story supported, quote unquote, bad behavior versus bad behavior that as designers we don't have the capacity to support in a robust way. And so like in the first case, what we might do to make this story feel more coherent is, say there's a main character you've been interacting with, and we've only given you reasons to like them. They give you cool quests, they give you cool rewards, they're nice to you, they're interesting, they're well written, great voice acting. Like, you have every reason to enjoy interacting with this character whenever you interact with them. But then, at a certain point, we reveal to you that they have some shady secret. And another character says, you know, they have this shady secret. It would actually be beneficial to you if that character wasn't around anymore. So in that case, we've now, in the story, presented to the player a choice where a character who's been really important and seems really important still, we've given them an incentive to explore the idea of, well, what would happen if I killed that character? It might actually help this other person over here or help me. And so in that case, when you go kill that character, it might feel to the player like you're misbehaving because they think that you're their friend, they trust you, all this stuff, and then you stab them in the back, right? But we've really sort of prepared the way for the player to do that. And we have planned for these two outcomes and supported them with like robust storytelling afterward. In the case that I think you're getting at of like, what happens when I meet that character for the first time and they're cool and awesome and want to give us great presents and quests and I just shoot them for no reason.
Yeah.
Right? That's the one we love. Right? That's the exciting one. The question is, you know, we haven't given the player any reason or incentive to do that. And so we obviously want the story to continue going, but also we have a limited amount of development time. And so we have to be selective with like, okay, are we going to support this with a full branching path of now the story branches into two separate branches that are fully supported all the way through the game? Or are we going to put a note on the body of that dead character that gives the player the story information they need to keep going? Because again, like I said before, you can't kill a note.
That's true.
Right. So, and I think what we do is try to create a balance of these things. Player misbehavior that is actually secretly planned for by us, that we've sort of seeded the idea for, versus player, quote unquote, misbehavior is maybe the wrong word, player testing. You know, they're sort of testing the boundaries. And we let them know, hey, we have accounted for this, but, you know, there wasn't a compelling reason to do this, so we're going to support it, but also we're not giving you this sort of story feedback that's going to encourage you to continue playing the game this way because it's not as rewarding story-wise as waiting for the other moment, if that makes sense.
No, it does. That makes perfect sense. I guess my question that would follow that, though, is, and maybe you don't have the answer, maybe I just want your opinion on this. Yeah. How do you gauge that balance? Like, how do you decide, okay, we're going to give it Baldur's Gate 3 treatment where we look at every possible, or going back to that environmental storytelling, what if you and I were to make a game where you're a detective who's also a pyromaniac and you might accidentally burn down every single crime scene? How do you account for that when you're supposed to be picking up clues? And where's the balance? Like, at what point do you decide, okay, this is such a fun idea that we're going to invest all that development time into building all these branches? Or, okay, that's cool, but it's not worth it. How do you...
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think this is a constant conversation on the side of the devs, which is the fun to work ratio.
That's a good...
Because here's the thing, like, we do tons of playtesting. We have fantastic QA teams who go through and play our game in every single imaginable way. And beautiful things will happen in playtesting that you didn't plan for. Like, I think famously I'm going to get this wrong. In Dishonored, there's some combination of powers you can use where it was like, I don't know if it was you could teleport to the mind of someone else and take over their body. And like, what if you took their dead body and then threw them over a fence and then, went into basically the idea that if you're working with a game that has a lot of systems that interact with each other, you might have like things that emerge from players just playing around that you didn't expect. And now there's like a way to solve all of the puzzles in your game, overcome all the obstacles in your game that's almost like cheat code level easy, right? Like, so when you arrive at, when you see something like this, you have to ask the question, okay, so this thing that just happened in playtesting is ridiculously fun and feels awesome. However, it breaks every level in our game. So the question is, are we going to go now through all of our levels and make sure that you cannot now cheat every single level with this new mechanism that we discovered in playtesting? Or are we now going to plan for the player to do that and then give some subtle hints that this is a thing that you might be able to do? Yes, you can kill a rat and then throw it over a fence and then teleport to the body of the rat. And now you basically have a teleport power, because players can feel super, super, super smart when they do things like that. And then if you don't allow it, they're disappointed. So the question of the balance is a case-by-case thing. You sort of have to evaluate, like, for instance, when it comes to killing characters, you have to ask the question, what are the ramifications of this character being dead for the rest of the game? And that will be a different calculation if it is the first hour of the game versus the last hour of the game. If it's the last hour of the game, I feel much happier to be like, everyone can die now, because we only have to support it for one more hour.
Right.
But if that happens at the very beginning of the game and this character is supposed to be here at hour 40, man, that's really going to be a lot of work on our part. And it means that if you have planned for that character to have a really satisfying arc, if you've planned for the player to have a really important relationship with that character, like you said, it's a question of balance. There's not one answer, but it's an evaluation of, is what we would lose in the player's relationship with this character, the story moments we have planned with this character, is it worth losing that for the player to get to express themselves in this moment in a way that feels motivated, interesting, right? And you make that call. I think when I first started, I was a little more militant about, like, well, the player should just be able to kill everyone all the time. And we did that in Weird West pretty much. But you'll also notice in Weird West, there is a group of characters you cannot kill. I don't know if you remember this. It is motivated by the story. There's a reason why you can't. It's not like you shoot them and the game doesn't respond at all to you trying to shoot them. It does respond, and there's a reason why you can't kill them that's motivated by the story, but you still remains that you can't kill them. These days, I might be more motivated to say, here's a main character that we need, or who's going to be important for the next 20 hours. So much of the story is riding on them. How about the first couple times we encounter them, we use some special video game design tricks to make them unkillable, even though it doesn't feel that way. Mm-hmm. So, classically, you put them behind some impenetrable glass. Yeah. We all know that, right? Or maybe they communicate to you via the radio. They talk to you through the radio, or send you a letter, or, these are the things we sort of think about as a cost-benefit analysis, because in the end, I want the player to have the most fun possible, and I want them to have the most exciting story possible, and I don't want them to rob themselves of a fun experience and a meaningful experience just because they're trying to test the limits of our game. I think testing the limits of a game is normal, but I don't want to punish them with a worse story if I don't have to.
As a player who likes to break games, like, takes the joy out of trying to find things that can be broken, when you run into those moments where you can't break this car, or you can't kill that character, or you can't burn down this house, you stop and you go, okay, well, this is obviously important. I'm going to move on. It doesn't bother me. Like, I get it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like you teach the player the rules of the game, and in like a Skyrim, for instance, it's like you can kill anyone, and then suddenly you try to kill that one guy or those, the king here or whatever, and like they are unkillable. And I have feelings about that. I think that the players often notice that boundary and then move on, and they just accept that as part of the world. And I think that that's totally legitimate, because video game designers only have so many years to make a game.
Exactly.
And you can't support everything.
When you run into those games where you can kill something important or kill everybody, and the developers had the time and resources to create a background for, again, Baldur's Gate 3, it's rewarding. But
yeah,
when you run into the game where you understand, okay, this is a narrative function, there's the narrative function to this thing, there's a suspension of disbelief. I'm playing a game. I get
definitely.
it. Move on.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think people immediately move on. I think that what I like most is, making a video game is a lot like being a magician, where the experience you have as a player is that a rabbit was pulled out of a hat and you don't know how it was done. And then that leads you to imagine that magician is magic, right? They have the ability to do things that seem impossible. If you would actually have that magician describe how it works, they're like, oh yeah, there's actually just a false bottom in this hat and the rabbit is there all along.
Yeah.
That sucks. You're like, oh damn, okay, it's not nearly as magical as I thought. But as long as the illusion is immersive, we all know that it's not real, but we are still enchanted by it, right? And I think similarly in games, you can be enchanted by it, even if if you would really think about it logically, like, oh, I'm sure that there aren't 1,000 different story branches in this game, but if we've done our job well enough, it feels like there are. And so what I like is, while I know that players are very accepting of these abstract limitations, I shoot at this character and nothing happens. While they accept that and move on, I prefer, if possible, to have these things motivated by the story, to be explained by the story, or be explained by the verbs that we give the player. They make sense. So for instance, like, say there's a game where you're a god who can fly around. That's cool. Well, what happens when they get to the edge of our game world? Can they just fly forever off? That doesn't feel good. So what you could do is you could put a big invisible wall around the whole island that they're on. And when you fly into that invisible wall, you hit it and you're like, oh, that was jarring. Your immersion is broken. But then you pretty quickly accept, okay, I guess I just won't do that again. Okay, fine. And that works, but I think there's a better way to do it, which is like, well, say you're actually like only half God, you're like a half deity, and actually your powers are only such that you can fly for a limited amount of time. It makes sense. You're only half deity, and you're on an island. And so naturally you have a stamina bar for flying and only do it for so long. So now when I try to fly off the island, nothing's stopping me from flying off the island, but eventually, with my half deity self, I get tired and I fall into the ocean and I drown. Yep. And the mechanisms are there for that. We haven't stopped you from doing it. There's a natural consequence to your action, and you have not felt the hand of the developer at all in that moment, right? Because it's motivated by the story. It's motivated by the mechanisms. It is of a piece of this world. So for me, that's a difference between like having these limitations, which you need limitations on every game. They're always there. There are limitations to what the player can do. Having those limitations be very visible and in your face, and like the dev is just punching you right through the screen, versus them being subtle, them being immersive. I think there's an art to disguising those limitations in your game that keep you feeling like the audience in the magic show, where like, it doesn't matter that, the tiger was already in the cage. The point is you never noticed the tiger entering the cage until it just appeared.
Right. Well, to call back to your magician analogy, You can watch somebody on the street do the bowling cups. We all know how bowling cups is done, but you go and watch Penn and Teller do it with their patter and their performance and their years and years of practice. Those are two very different experiences.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the immersion is total, right? The immersion is total. And that's, I think, for those of us who have worked in the quote unquote immersive sim space, I think that's the idea. Is that you can just maintain the illusion throughout the experience and it never falters. Yeah.
Well, buddy, I think we're starting to get long on time. So let's start pulling this together here. First of all, before we get too close to the end, I want to touch on your work on Weird West.
Sure.
In there, can you a little more about how you approached that narrative that allowed for the crazy things you did for player-driven changes to the world and the story? How did you still maintain the cohesive? You've touched on it, but is there anything else you learned in that process you can share?
Sure. I mean, God, I learned so much working on Weird West. I think that there are sort of like unsexy practical answers to this, which are
we like those too.
Yeah, I think the truth is that I learned what we've spent the last hour talking about, this delineation of where is the story located in the game? What is the mechanism of delivery of this plot point, for instance, versus what can the player affect? And I think in that game, one thing that I learned is that, like we were talking about just now with the not breaking the illusion, that if you're going to have a game where the player is allowed to disrupt story mechanisms, it is basically a series of fail-safes until there needs to be an ultimate, this will never fail-safe. So for instance, like in the case of, I'll talk more abstractly, like say there's a character who is really important later in the game and you kill them, the first line of defense or the first way the story might pivot is that their son contacts you and is going to continue on the story from a different perspective. Now it's like, oh man, my father's dead, you asshole. But the plot, as we've set it out, is such that there's that moment of choice where the player kills that character or not. But very quickly, the story comes back to a sort of choke point where it's like, no matter what, you were still going to do the quest where you stole the documents from the whatever. And it just is whether the dad is giving you the objective or his son is giving you the objective. But still, the quest is the same. There are some slight differences in dialogue, etc. So there's that. And that's a more expensive way of solving that problem, because now we need a new character, we need dialogue for that new character, what have you. So then what happens, the next obvious question is, well, the son comes trotting into town, they're about to take over for their dad in the story, and the player is like, I'm gonna kill you too, bam. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then can we have that kid's brother come and now be the quest giver? Like, at a certain point, it's like, it can't just be turtles all the way down. At a certain point, there needs to be a way to deliver this plot point that the player cannot affect. And it depends on the game, depends on the genre, depends on the verbs. In Weird West, it's like, well, they can never kill a note, they can never kill a journal, they can never kill an item. And so I think what I learned in Weird West is that there is a safety and a confidence you can have in plot mechanisms being located in stuff that the player can't affect. And so if you're being smart, you might design the story. This is where narrative design comes into play. You might design the story in such a way that while the characters around this quest you're doing are interesting, you can develop relationships with them and all this stuff, the actual mechanisms of the quest are based on going and finding objects in an enemy-ridden territory. It's like, you can shooty all you want if that's what's actually required to complete this. So the sort of unsexy answer is like, I learned you can't do turtles all the way down, and you can support variance in the story up to a certain extent in a robust way, but then in the end, you're going to need a journal or you're going to need a ghost who you can't shoot come in and now here's the thing, Gerald. Here's what I learned. Every game needs a quest giver that's just a ghost. Because you can't kill a ghost. Just put a ghost in it. That is like sort of the mantra that I feel like I live by now. Just put a ghost in it.
That's a pretty sexy answer.
Yeah, thank you. We got there eventually.
Maybe every game needs a narrator voice. After he has killed that character, he later learns.
Exactly. The narrator every game needs a Cortana, right? I mean, like, think about Halo.
Cortana's a ghost.
Cortana is a ghost. Every game needs a disembodied voice that you can't shoot.
Destiny actually calls their ghost.
Is that right? I actually haven't played it.
The disembodied voice is Ghost.
They've learned the lesson too.
There you go. All right. Well, I think that kind of brings to close our conversation on that particular topic. You nailed it. We've all learned a whole lot from you right there. I love it.
Well, it's been a total joy. Thank you, Gerald.
Before we go, though, I got some fun questions.
I'm ready.
All right.
Yeah.
So first of all, there is a question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, regardless what field you work in, what you're working on, what you do. And that question is, I personally believe there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but improv, comic books, board games, all of these things where we can all just hang out. Everybody naturally gets along. There's a shared fellowship that just happens to exist. If you agree with me, and not everybody who's been on the show did agree with me, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds all that together?
Ooh. My inclination is definitely yes. First of all, yes. I think You're right. Is your question more about the connection between you and the other people who are hanging out, engaging in the medium, or about like your interaction with the medium itself?
The fun thing about that question is I purposely make it vague so that you can interpret it whatever way means the most to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to games and story, to me, I think what's great about the game medium, and so your question is about like the commonality between all these different media and how we interact with them.
It could be. It could also be a question about the shared psychology. It could also be a question about sociology and why communities exist. It could also be like,
I think it's our natural inclination to experience feelings. Really. I mean, I think that we all are drawn to stories. I think we're all drawn to stories, first of all. And when you watch a movie, when you watch a TV show, when you play a game, they all have story of a kind. But really, there's like underneath that, there's an emotional experience you're having where you are being lifted out of your everyday emotional humdrum. Actually, it might not be humdrum. It might be extremely intense. But you're lifted out of whatever your day-to-day emotional experience is and given the chance. I mean, this is my argument for humanities in general and why reading is important, why we just need more funding for humanities, Gerald. And the reason is because it teaches us how to feel stuff. It lets us practice feeling things, experiencing emotions. It lets us play at how do I react to this? If you watch a movie and there's heartbreak, you might say, oh gosh, how would I react in that situation? What would I do if I was heartbroken? What would I do? In games, you get to experience something similar, which is what would I do if I was in this situation? The game makes you feel things, and then you get to practice feeling frustration, anger, love, intrigue. You get to practice all of these things, and I think it gives us emotional elasticity and, like similar to why some people practice meditating. You get to sort of like learn how to observe your feelings and learn how to, see yourself and disconnect your actions from immediate response. It's like kind of in the same space of getting to practice and play in emotional spaces that you might not always get to.
That's a good answer, man.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you. What a great question. I love that.
All right. Well, no more serious stuff. We're going to head out the door right away here. First, I'd like to do a couple quick fire just to get to know Lucas a little better.
Sure.
What are you reading right now?
I just finished a book called A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled. I think his name is pronounced Hosseini. I may be getting that wrong. And then right now in this moment, I'm reading Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, which is a lot of fun right now. Really, really fun.
What are you playing these days?
I'm still making my way through Tears of the Kingdom, which I am loving. Maybe less than Breath of the Wild, but still loving. And I'm actually finally playing GTA 5 for the first time ever, believe it or not.
I never found the time to, so I'm jealous.
Yeah, it's zany. It's fun. It's exactly what you'd expect. It's great.
Right. Do you listen to anything while you write? And if so, what?
Oh, yeah. I have a playlist that I've been listening to since I was literally 14 or 15. And it's all based on the soundtrack for the TV show Samurai Champloo. If anyone's watched that show, it's the same director as Cowboy Bebop. And it's an incredible show. And the whole soundtrack is instrumental hip hop. And it was like before lo-fi was cool, before lo-fi hip hop was a thing. It was Samurai Champloo soundtrack, and specifically an artist named Nujabes. Highly encouraged. Go look him up and just vibe for hours.
I'm going to check that out. Okay, last quick fire. If your essence was perfectly distilled down and then injected into a game, whether that's a digital game, board game, tabletop role-playing game, A, what world would it be? And B, what would your race and class or character be?
Okay, well, I think at the core of my being is like a love of like the magic and mystery of existence and I love stories and worlds that are filled with lots of heart and sentiment. So I feel like if I could make a Studio Ghibli movie into a game, that's where I would want to be. And I would be probably some sort of like magician type character. Magicians are really a theme of this whole episode. I just want to be a magician that, sparks wonder and amazement in the hearts of others. That's all.
What if I told you already are?
Oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind right now.
That's a good answer, buddy.
Thank
all
you.
These are good answers, so I'm going to stop saying that now. All right. We're going to start heading for the door. But first, I like to hold a little space. Is there anything you're working on or have worked on in the past you want to boost? Where can people find you online? Here's a chance to share your stuff.
Sure. Well, I'm on Twitter/X at Lucas Loredo, which is my full name. But my website is a great place to look, lucasloredo.com. And I'm working on a new game for WolfEye Studios, which I'm extremely excited about.
Nice.
It's a retro sci-fi RPG first person, which I'm allowed to say only because it's already been revealed. And people are welcome to look at my website. And I do consulting work, narrative design work on the side. So I'm out there. And any studios who are trying to, do some magic.
Yep. Give Lucas.
I'm always up for it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I'm going to push you back out into the cold as you're heading for the door. Do you have any parting words of wisdom? I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh my gosh, parting words of wisdom. Well, the only thing I would say is for people who want to get into game writing, it's something I've noticed lately. Read some books. Y'all, go out and read some books. Learning about writing from games is a dangerous business. So what I would say, here's my parting words of wisdom. If you want to become a game writer, start by writing other stuff and getting really good at writing fiction or screenplays. Get really good at that stuff. And then add the special considerations of game writing afterward, because y'all need to learn how to punctuate.
Mm-hmm. Either someone's been messing with the animate spells on the privy seats again, or I have a mimic infestation I have to go deal with. Either way, it's time to close the doors. But before I send you out, I would like to thank Lucas again for sharing his wisdom and insights with us this evening. And as always, to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, remember to keep exploring, creating, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.